language in which you wish to receive the information. So using the 3 dots, you can choose, I believe it's one of 40 some languages from which you want to see. So if you're using the 3 dots at the bottom, you should be able to choose which language you want to showcase this presentation in. Je t'aime aussi, Eric. Eric is one of my favorite people on this earth. So let's go and do this. Donc, again, super happy that Seema accepted to join this conversation. I'm very thankful and grateful. Well, it's an inside joke. Yeah, it's because I'm like a mama bear towards these files and the people leading them. So it's an inside joke, such as the people that I like to mentor. I call them my cubs. So it's a cute clin d'œil là. So we will go employment equity plans discussion. Like I said, it's not a formal presentation. It's really just a conversation for us to have because I'm grateful and thinking very grateful and thinking there's a specific need. I have a whole lot of people who ask me, how do I do an EE plan? You're presenting me with your plans and I'm super thankful. Merci. Merci de penser à moi. Merci de m'inclure. But to me, it just rose how many people have that need. So tout ça pour dire, this is it. So we're having this conversation. Throughout this actual conversation, we'll be seeing the reasons to have a plan, the process, so how you create your plan, the format, I like to call it the container versus the content approach. So what does it look like, but what's in it as well? And then the follow-up methods, because you do need the follow-up. It's not just writing the plan. And I will let Seema address this slide. I'm sorry, it's not the latest version. Super sorry. Give me a minute. That's what Seema was about to tell me, I think. That's it. It happens. Life happens. Voilà. That's what happens when you use new technology. Et voilà. And there we go.
Okay, you speak. I can speak to this. So these are all legislations that are either that are related to what employment equity deals with, right? And it's really about systemic barriers or discrimination, if you want to call it, faced by the equity groups under the Employment Equity Act. I do want to highlight a couple of them specifically, like the Accessible Canada Act. That's new, and many of you have to do accessibility plans, I'm sure. And the thing that I want to stress here is that you should think about doing your employment equity plan, which we're going to talk about, to be consistent with your accessibility plans. That's important. It's because they overlap quite a bit in what you're supposed to do under the Accessible Canada Act and the Employment Equity Act. The others are mentioned, like Canadian Charter of Rights and Human Rights and Freedoms and Canadian Human Rights Act. The Charter is obviously constitutional, and the Canadian Human Rights Act is considered semi-constitutional, right? So those are our supreme governing legislations, and everything is supposed to be interpreted according to them, including the Employment Equity Act. And then the Canada Labour Code, Multiculturalism Act, United Nations Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and other United Nations related legislation like the Declaration of Human Rights. They're all sort of provide some interpretive tools on employment equity. The Canadian Labour Code specifically has provisions around harassment and discrimination, and how to harassment, I should say, sorry, and how to deal with that, which can sometimes overlap with some of the other equity-related issues. And so I think that's enough. Is that enough?
It is. So it's to highlight, basically you're doing an EE plan, maybe for those that didn't understand why, but you're doing an EE plan, but you should really look at all these considerations, and within the scope of your work, all of these acts really do apply. So there's one act and it's currently under review. We're expecting the recommendations, I want to say very quickly, although I doubt it, but it's currently in translation. So there's an embargo. I should have more information tomorrow to share, but it's going to be very restricted because, as I say, embargo. Okay. But thank you, Seema. And Seema kindly indicated that I should extract these various articles from the EE Act in itself. So there are specific identified responsibilities that the employer, so Government of Canada, meaning also your various departments, are to really follow in the implementation of the EE Act. There's somebody that's not on mute, but feel free if you have a question, like feel free to raise your hand. And really the act, when it was designed and implemented initially in 1986, so ça fait longtemps, it aimed to identify and eliminate barriers for the 4 designated groups. As we know, currently in employment equity, we're talking about women, racialized, visible minorities, people, Indigenous peoples, as well as persons with disabilities. Donc, you were also to implement specific measures to improve the conditions or how the people were able to navigate within your organization. And then I promised the interpreters I would not read the slides, so I'm paraphrasing. So in doing, and that's one very important slide, I will say, in terms of the 9.1 and 9.3, because we recently came about that oh, Brenda, yay. I'll get back to your question, Brenda, in a second, or Seema can. Within the scope of self-identification, we had been using self-identification for HR purposes, as 9.1 was not clearly understood. So in more recent years, we've seen a new interpretation, which means that between 9.1 and 9.3, what we can do with self-identification at this point is statistical analysis and look at the gaps and look at the issues and come up with action plans to implement what we're looking at in terms of the issues we identify in the analyses. However, I want to say when I even started in EE, we would say, okay, well, Jean-Marc is self-ID'd as a person with a disability. If there's a network event, I'll give Jean-Marc's name because he said yes to sharing their information. So there's been a different interpretation in how we can use the self-identification information. Seema, are you willing to take Brenda's question in how does the EE Act define employer for the purposes of the applicability? It's lawyer talk.
Well, I'll try. I'll try to take this on. So, so basically, the employer for the federal public services purposes is Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission. So they sort of have different responsibilities. The Public Service Commission around the staffing piece, as you know, and then Treasury Board as the employer. But Treasury Board is really the one that oversees things under the Act. So departments are required to report certain things, as you know, to Treasury Board as the employer for the federal public service. But then under the Act too, individual departments are responsible for also undertaking their employment equity obligations, if I can say that, and which Marilyn is going to be talking about further, what those obligations are. I'm not sure if that's helpful. No, it doesn't exclusively apply to the public service. So that's why I was saying for the federal public service, there's employers under the private sector. So the like federal legislation, like the employment equity, applies to those that are under federal jurisdiction. So like banking, communications, transportation. I may be missing something as well, right? So they're considered private sector. They have employment equity obligations as well. There's also something called the Federal Contractors Program. So if there is certain number of employees and a certain amount of a contract with the federal government, then they can fall under the Employment Equity Act, under the Federal Contractors Program. It's complicated, but I hope in a simple terms as if that's good enough. Oh, do you want to take on that question of
I will.
self-ID?
I just wanted maybe to complement to what you just mentioned in terms of the federal contractors program. So the people doing Treasury Board Secretariat the submissions review, it's oftentimes like one of those components where the contract will require people to submit how many people in their workforce belong to each of the EE groups. So that was just a compliment. For Suzanne, self-ID is really within the scope of the purposes of the EE Act. Self-declaration is linked to the Public Service Employment Act. So the two systems theoretically don't touch each other. The self-ID is really purposes, as I said, in 9.1 and 9.3 for statistical analysis. Self-declaration information can be used for statistical analysis, but also within the scope of the consent statement, then you can use it for appointment purposes. So they're under different legislation. Oh, yay, Victoria, who also provided input on the actual presentation. So I reverted back to the white background. Merci pour le conseil. Wonderful. We'll move on. If at any point it's not clear what is meant by the slides, feel free to ask questions as folks have been doing. Voilà, the meat and potatoes. So the employment equity plan, which we are addressing today. So it's really, and positive policies, I like to call them initiatives, really, that you will implement because, or activities, that's how they will be defined in your plan. So it's about what will you do based on your analysis to be able to create progress for the EE groups. So really, within the scope of the EE Act, you do see the specific steps at 10.1 and 10.2, which is on the other slide, of what should be going into a plan. I won't read off the slides. This is one that relates really clearly to clerk's call to action in terms of numerical goals. So some people might be surprised. I've seen a lot of plans in recent years. You need to have goals, quantitative goals, so numbers, to fill your gaps when you're creating an EE plan. So it's within the scope of the legislation, and it's within, and if we want to make it about a social context now, it's within the scope of the clerk's call to action, where there is also mention of having numerical goals. So there is a way to define what those goals are. Benchmarks we'll discuss at a later time, but really you should assess what it looks like, and then we'll have a quick conversation about ESR, or a quick touch point of ESR. But really, you should look at what it's looking like when you're creating your actual plan, and how do you fill those gaps. This is where the benchmark becomes important, and how do you surpass filling that gap. So really, it's one thing that needs to be clear also. I've seen EE plans without numbers, so it's bar graphs. Don't know what they mean. You need to make sure that your plan is self-explanatory. When somebody looks at it, they understand what it means. It's not just bar graphs. It's actually, we're trying to fill so many positions with so many people from so many groups. It's just something that needs to take place. I'll leave it at that. I don't know, Seema, did you have anything you wanted to add on the Article 10?
No, I think you've covered it. Sure.
Thank you. Then we come back to why do an EE plan? Well, as I mentioned, the Act came into place in 1986, came into force, and how much progress we've seen, I don't know that we've reached the essential goal of 1986, that we would achieve equity. Now, how we define equity is up to everybody, but really, there were specific terminology in the Act and specific intent in the Act in 1986. So really, we aimed at the time to see efforts towards measurable progress. That's why numbers are very important. We do see often shopping lists or grocery lists in terms of activities within the scope of the plans. There's no measurable action. So we see, okay, well, I'm doing this guide or I'm doing this training, but really what happened after this was provided or this was created? So what is the actual progress that it led to? So I did this event, okay, but what happened after? So there's that focus that I feel, and I'm talking from the I perspective, have feel has been lost over the years. And really, it's important for, and then that's my HR spin. It's important for people to do plans, yes, to measure the efforts, but also acknowledge if they've done progress. So it's a good way to see yes or no, I've progressed. If not, then you need to review your policies and programs. But it's also, if you did do well, then it's an important milestone to acknowledge as well. As we say, there's legislative requirements and that are in place within the scope of the EE Act. And I think it's important, I think, but somebody also mentioned in the comments that it's important that an EE plan is not an EE program. So your plan is what the department or agency or what have you will do in terms of meeting those quantitative and qualitative goals within the scope of your plan. But EE programs, it's like the people leading the actual program. The plans can refer to a whole bunch of OPIs, so Office of Primary Interests. Well, your EE program is led by a specific team with specific responsibilities to implement the plan, monitor the plan, report on the plan, and very much do the analysis and a whole bunch of other tasks. But it's just there's a difference between the EE plans and the actual EE programs. Questions or comments at this point? So if people didn't have the deck, feel free to email me. It's possible that it got lost somewhere in transit, but feel free and I'll send it to you. How to do an EE plan? I'll let Seema address that.
So, so as a sort of like a quick recap as well. So you've done your workforce analysis, right? So you've done your self ID. You've taken sort of if you want to call it a census of the workplace representation you have through the self ID, and then you can see where they're underrepresented or not. I just wanted to bring that back. And then you do your employment systems review, right? You base the employment systems review on the underrepresentation, the things that you've discovered, because the employment systems review will highlight what are the barriers for those groups, right? And so the employment systems review, you're looking at formal and informal policies. You're looking at, because, you know, sometimes the barriers are in the informal, right? Like the way people interact with each other or who's telling who about what job postings or things like that. So you examine everything related to staffing, but other things too that could have created barriers. And then you get to the employment equity plan, right? Then you're going to lay out what your actions are going to be. And I kind of recap that because it requires consultations of various stakeholders, including bargaining agents, right? And I want to emphasize that we shouldn't confuse bargaining agents with members of equity-seeking groups, because I will say my experience has been from certain departments saying that, oh, we have consulted. Well, you haven't actually consulted the bargaining agent. So there is a specific provision in the Employment Equity Act, Section 15, that requires employers to consult bargaining agents where they exist. Okay, it says employee representatives, but bargaining agents where they exist. When we talk about consulting bargaining agents, it's not about consulting someone who happens to be in a bargaining agent. They actually have to be appointed, selected by the bargaining agent to be that person that you're consulting with for the employment equity plan purposes. As people often confuse that, because people will say we've consulted at our diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, or what, so that's not that's so fine, and that's okay to do, but that's not the same thing as what you're legislatively required under Section 15, because bargaining agents are involved right from the beginning, right from the workforce analysis, the employment systems review, and drafting the employment equity plan, as well as monitoring it and implementing it, and so on. It's the expression is consult and collaborate. Okay, doesn't mean co-management, but it does mean getting meaningful input and collaboration with bargaining agents through all of these steps. So I've highlighted the bargaining agents. I don't know if you want to highlight any of the other ones.
So key primary office of interest, OPIs, for those in the slang, in acronyms, it's really who's going to deliver various activities. So whether it's learning, training, classification, look at them. It could be even an external facing party. So somebody who has a specific interaction with clients or candidates. So that's your OPI, employees representatives. It's what some refer to as ERGs as well. So your networks, bargaining agents. So depending on where you work in the department or agency, there are various bargaining agents. Management. So of course, they need to be approving their own initiatives, because they'll have to implement and actually monitor on their own end. Members of equity-seeking groups. So yes, oftentimes what we see is like, oh, well, we consulted the chairs. Okay, great for various networks, but what does the membership think? So if you went only to the chairs, and let's say the chairs are appointed in specific departments where there's, I'll just say it like this, controlling the narrative of what's happening within committees or networks, then what does the employee that doesn't have access to these specific consultation have to think about the plan? So really, it's maybe putting in place a survey that goes directly to employees. Maybe it's having a generic mailbox that anybody has comments, they can send them to. Let's say you're doing a consultation plan that's very broad. It's maybe having focus sessions that's open to all, and then people can just attend and provide comments on your upcoming plan. So it's just extending the scope beyond just the chairs of your networks. It's really all employees beyond network representation, and HR professionals, because really, in theory, they should be implementing the plan, creating the plan, and doing the consultations in collaboration with all the other stakeholders. On va aller à la prochaine. Puis à tout moment, là, je sais que je le fais pas mal en anglais. À tout moment, si vous avez des questions, des commentaires en français, n'hésitez pas. Je suis là pour ça. Donc, sentez-vous bien à l'aise de jaser dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Pas les autres langues, je ne suis pas là encore. À part l'espagnol, on pourrait s'essayer un peu. So feel free to use the language of your choice, official languages of your choice, open to either. But feel free really to have this conversation with us. Et merci, Patrice, pour le guide sur les systèmes d'emploi. Donc, la commission a créé des guides sur les systèmes d'emploi. So the Public Service Commission did create those guides that Patrice did put in the chat. Donc, merci beaucoup. Format of the EE plan. This is what I say in terms of content versus container. So you are required to make it legible. So for people to be able to understand what it means. I've seen plans that are written in such a beautiful and flowery language, but in the end, you have no idea what they're trying to say. And sometimes it's skirting the actual issues when you're just putting all those beautiful words together. So it's writing it in a very plain language so anybody can understand it. It needs to be communicated, so it needs to be posted online so anybody that wants to refer to it can actually look at it. Alternate formats. So if you have people that require, I wouldn't say Braille at this point because really it's getting out the door, but if you require other alternate formats, or even if people, and that's me maybe who's overdoing it, if people want to have a conversation to better understand the various components of the EE plan, you should be offering that as well. It might be offering various sessions. There's the cool word socializing your plan so people see who's implementing the plan, also can ask direct questions, and really those presentations. So usually when you do a plan, you should be standing it up and sideways. So everybody should have a look and be able to discuss what's in the plan. I'll just, it's nowhere, but just to mention that the EE plans are to be DM approved, so deputy heads are supposed to sign off on your departmental or organizational plans as well. So that was a format or the container within the scope of the content. So what does it have? As I say, there's a quantitative and qualitative information that should be included. When I say layman's terms or plain language, des activités et des données, activities and data. So what it relates to and the various steps that you should take. So really you should establish, as with any really activity or project you're going to undertake, you should document your process. One, because anybody could ask you how you did it. So you should really document the various steps that you are going to take. You should, and that's my strong language, you should make this plan available to your OPIs so they can comment on the process you're going to take and how you intend to actually do the process and who's going to be involved, as well as timelines. And Brenda, I remember process is as important as results. So that's one beautiful takeaway I got from you over the years. So the workforce analysis, as Thema mentioned, you need to gather all of that data. Environmental scan, and I do have Samir on the line. Samir is a master at environmental scans. So this is when you're looking at what's the current trends. So United Nations, the case of people of African descent, the clerk's call to action. What else is coming in? Maybe the EE Act reform will have some impact. You're doing a review of everything that could have an actual impact on the plan you're about to create. So there's your data, there's policy work involvement. It's a big task. Like people don't see it often, how much work goes into an environmental scan, but you should really assess all of these key drivers and how they will impact your work. It could be the math. Well, it should be also the math. So there's a whole lot of various initiatives and key policies that you should look at. Short-term numerical goals, as we say, you look at your ESR, you look at what your issues are in terms of quantitative representation, and then you should establish goals based on that. In the short term is within the next year. Oftentimes you can do over the next 3 years, which you expect to be able to do over the next 3 years. Actions, so these are the activities that relate to improvements in your actual departments, including, so this is my OPI, this is the accountability, and this is the timeline. So it's not like, okay, this person will do this at some point. You really need to have somebody assigned to the activity and when they intend to do it by. And then monitoring and revision. So really you need to look at the plan once within the lifetime of the plan, it's called, but really some people do it every year. I'm a big fan of doing it every year just because you keep on top of everything. You can look at all your various components to make sure that you are still on track, that you take into account. Let's say something drastic happens. Let's say people who had an equity plan in place and then the clerk's call to action came into play. Okay, yes, the legislation was still being followed, but maybe that had an impact on the activities, maybe not on the quantitative, but on the qualitative aspects of your plan. Any questions or comments? I do see a few questions. I'll just scroll up.
Can I just add to that a
Yes,
little
yes,
bit?
go ahead.
Yeah, because it relates to the question as to how often you do it. And I really liked you saying that you look at it every year, but sometimes like employment systems review, and you could correct me, but they're not done every year.
No.
They're done like every 3 years or maybe a little bit longer. But so in your employment equity plan, you'll have like short-term goals that this will be done, and you can have long-term and medium-term goals as well. Because you might not be able to deal with all the barriers right away, which is ideal. That's what we all want. But sometimes it takes a little bit of time, so you can have those. So usually you would be reviewing the plan yearly, and I actually recommend with bargaining agents, joint employment equity committees, that they meet 3 to 4 times a year, so they can go through and see what's happening. Does it need to be revised? Because you don't want to find out 3 years into the plan that things that you were thinking of doing didn't work. And so that's why you want to revise it as things go on. But you do plan for about 3 years, and sometimes it's a little longer than that. And I'll let you speak to more of that. I hope that answers that question.
Yes. I see somebody has questions about oui, c'est ça, Eric. So I would say that, okay, Eric, c'est juste un beau commentaire. Okay, wonderful. So yes, really, there's a lot. I would say, honestly, what I've seen in terms of ESRs, I want to say minimal. People do them every 5 years. I've seen, and I won't name it. And there was a department, it was over 20 years, and you're like, oh mon Dieu, anything could have happened in 20 years. So I think there's very much work and awareness to be done around the ESRs as well. Puis peut-être Patrice, juste en prendre note, je sais que tu travailles sur quelque chose en ce moment. Donc, il y a beaucoup de travail à faire justement pour aller sensibiliser les gens à ESR. Donc, des beaux commentaires. And thank you, Seema, for adding. Now, don't throw rocks at me. I'm fully aware these are based on WFA 2016, and it's only for the visual effect of you looking at what a table with data should be. So really, currently we're still under the WFA 2016 because we're still waiting on the EE Act recommendations, which I can't believe they'll still make us use WFA, knowing how long it takes between a census and our data set internal to the core public service. So really, what you should be looking at is a benchmark. And I'm a big proponent of using everything that's been published recently, whether it's the DemoSim projections, if only to assess yourself back pocket with all that information to see how real your gaps really are when you're not looking at WFA. So whether it's that, looking at the disproportionality index that Dr. Nicholas presented along with Shamir and colleagues from StatsCan. So all that to say, that's my editorial in terms of benchmarks. But really, what you look at is your benchmark, whichever one you choose, and then your current representation, which is based on self-identification information in your HR system. Now, I know we have people who are using 9.1, 8.9, and a few other legacy systems, I guess, from agencies. But really, then you establish your gaps and you see, okay, where do I want to go? So some will use WFA, which is not, I'll say it, it's not real because we're 7 years later. So whatever was there at the time, the current Canadian population looks no longer like that. So you can choose to go by that, which is a very minimal legislative requirement, let's say, and you can use other data sets. 10 minutes. Because if you look at the representation, it's higher than the benchmark pour Suzanne. So your benchmark would be 13%, your current representation would be 18%, so then you have a plus of overrepresentation en guillemets of that many employees for that specific group. Est-ce que ça marche, Suzanne?
Can I add to that a little bit?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is really helpful to kind of see where your gaps up when you're trying to, figure out your employment systems review in your plan. But we've kind of moved to making sure that we're doing subgroups within these categories. And so some departments are doing that. So for example, in the quote unquote visible minorities, because we know that's not the right word we should be using anymore, but that's what the Employment Equity Act says. You would now break that down into Black, South Asian and Chinese and so on in the different categories. So you could really see, because I think someone's pointing out, oh, look, under the under that category, there seems to be, there isn't a gap. We never say like, oh, they're overrepresented. We just say there isn't a gap, and that's totally fine. Right? We're always like really honing into the underrepresentation, because we don't want to give a perception that, we have too many of a particular equity group. But if you actually dug deeper into that, we might see gaps for specific subgroups.
Exactly.
And that's important.
I was just going to say that's also one of our struggles. So we can capture self-identification by sub-EE groups. We're stuck in needing or wanting WFA by sub-EE groups, which we've never seen, which we would love to see. So in terms of sub-EE groups, the only thing that's wonderful at this point, in terms of giving us an actual or as accurate of a portrait as possible, would be the demo sim projections, because they can extract based on the census the actual sub-EE groups, which is beautiful to see, really. So yes, and these numbers, as I say, we're assessing ourselves against super old data. So I expect current representation to be around 20%, let's say, for racialized people. So yes, it looks good on paper, such as and that's another editorial, as some of the latest reports we might have seen on EE. But then when you start looking at the numbers and what they're assessing themselves against, it's very, very outdated information. Deepika?
Yeah. And can I just add one
Go
more
ahead.
thing? And it's just like, I want to go back to that visible minority because it seems, but if you look at the executive level, you see underrepresentation, right? Because the WFA is 14 and the representation is 10 by 8. And you see like, wow, there's a cluster of racialized folks in the administrative and FS. So sometimes the representation, like you really do need to dig. That's why it's so important to do this kind of exercise, because just looking at it at a superficial level sometimes doesn't give you the full story. Just wanted to add that.
Thank you. And maybe the parallel before Deepika mentions her comment or question. Let's say for women, the traditional administrative category, like if you have a gap, then it's a small gap. I wouldn't freak out because it means that they're now represented elsewhere in other occupational categories. So there's some of these that you need to interpret, like what's happening here. So yes, a lot of data interpretation from one simple table. Deepika?
Yes, thank you. This has been a great presentation. I really appreciate the deep dive and the attention to the details. I think this is kind of like a constant pet peeve of mine about the way that we have this conversation around measurement. Why is it, I put my question in the chat too, why is it that we only think about EE and other equity groups in terms of over and underrepresentation? Given both the gaps and the outdated data, why don't we actually apply overrepresentation to dominant groups? For instance, groups that are racialized as white, both men and women.
So I can try and answer. I will say one thing I like to do that's not captured in specific activities, but that's wonderful information for me to have. I do EE versus non-EE. So basically, what does the situation look like for white cisgendered able-bodied men? I think it's very telling. With the new self-ID app by TBS that will one day be released, it's one of the identity factors that will be captured. So hoping that we can get the full portraits of all these identities and that we would be able to do exactly as you're referencing. So let's say the cisgender able-bodied man would be, let's say, underrepresentation overall, but then they'd be overrepresented in the EX category, if that makes sense. Feel free to say no, Deepika, if it doesn't.
Yeah, I think Deepika asks a really good question about looking at the dominant groups when we're looking at this stuff. That's why, like, I personally don't talk about overrepresentation of equity groups. I only look at it as the floor. This is the minimum that you should have of an equity group. You can always have more, especially because the WFA is inadequate, outdated, and sometimes doesn't capture the numbers because of the actual census problems in that. So that's why in some ways it's about who isn't there, but you could flip it to who's there too much in the dominant group. So thanks for that question, actually.
And it's, we'll say it again for women, let's say, it's easier to do. Let's say if you're using LMAs, then you can see that they're very well represented or overrepresented as opposed to the benchmark for women. But if you disaggregate, at times you'll find surprises as well. So it can be done, but it's not currently done. That's not.
Is there a reason why it's not currently done, or is it like that? You know, it's like the root cause reason why it's not currently done.
I think it's a root cause. I think it's we're going for the, as I say, legislative, a bit like Sima said, the floor. So the current legislative requirements are really to report on the 4 EE groups. Even the sub EE groups are beautiful to see or wonderful to see, but they're not legislated right now for us to report on. So you will rarely see anything being done, but it's a wonderful assessment to take on. Now, talking capacity, I don't know that everybody has capacity. I know that some folks don't even have access to data, even from an HR perspective. Some HR folks are not given access to some of the data to do the actual analysis, but I'd love to see what we can do. And it could be within the scope of the EE Act amendments or overhauling, as they say that they're going to do. But a super valid point. It's not that I don't take it in. I think
for sure.
So I would love to see it. I'm just hoping it's going to come, but why it's not done yet? Why are we still using WFA 2016? It's kind of like the same. Let's copy paste the reason there.
I see that. Okay, I mean, definitely something to kind of chew on a bit more if a group of people is really interested in kind of exploring it and figuring out how we can actually do it, because there's compromised data across this space, right? So that might just be another compromised data point, but not that we can't work something out.
True. Can try.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Okay, and I see a few questions. Feel free to ask also verbally by raising your virtual hand. Okay, and then we'll move on. Workforce promotions, and this is also one that could be a debate. I'm hoping you can speak to this while we are on the holding this out. Just a second, maybe if you can verbally address. Okay, yes. So there's a list in terms of occupational categories, if that's the question that was above. There's an actual list if you need that list to know what occupational categories have in terms of actual classification. Une belle parenthèse là, ici. When we went from 8.9 to 9.1 within the scope of PeopleSoft, a whole lot of us lost capacity to disaggregate where our specific gaps are. So I just want to raise that consideration. But if you need the list of what job classifications fall into occupational categories, feel free to write and I will send you what I have. And again, maybe it's going back in time, but and I know we're getting short on time, but really there's the national occupational category groups that are created by ESDC. Those are matched with the census data. Ah, beautiful, merci Jean-Emmanuel. So those are matched, the NOC are matched with the census data. And then all of these data sets are matched with the Treasury Board Secretariat pay lists, which then creates our WFA. So there's a lot of data manipulation that also happens, but I just thought that the parenthèse might be interesting for those that don't have that that background. So what we create in terms of goals is really where you see the gaps. So I don't know if it's addressing the question. So you would look at the, let's say in this example, something in blue and try to fix that gap. Oui, go ahead. Your hand is raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Sorry, I am on Nicole's team there. I think what we've noticed is that the language in the EEA asks for goals by occupational group. So beyond, let's say, administrative and FS, we're looking at the ASs and the CRs and so on. But other documents that we've gotten is only like this, what we're looking at right now is only at the category itself. So it's a lot more broad. And we've gotten some information like that from the CHRC too. So we're just not sure where to set our goals at the category level or at the group
At
level.
the classification. Yes, okay, yeah. I understand. So that's where my parenthèse about going from 8.9 to 9.1 in terms of PeopleSoft seems innocuous. Really, in application when you're creating goals is an actual issue because now you're not seeing the disaggregation of who belongs to each of the occupational category in terms of pockets of underrepresentation. So it's a conversation I'd love to have with TBS. I don't know that any of them are on the line, especially when we're looking at creating this new application that will, I don't know how, talk to our various levels and us being able to match what is in self-identification portal as well as what we have on our end. I don't know how those will connect for us to be able to track our representation even by occupational category, less alone like how we disaggregate, but I've seen both. I personally like by classification. I know that justice we were still using 8.9, so it was beautiful. We used to get pivot tables from TBS. We would just pop them into our Excel spreadsheet with our various representation, and then you would be able to find where your specific gaps of underrepresentation were. I will say that since the move to 9.1, I personally, moi-même, have not been able to do it as someone who manipulates the data. So I don't know, une très longue explication.
Non, ça va. Merci.
If I can just add to that, so I've seen both. So you know, as bargaining agents, we prefer it to be broken down beyond the occupational category and actually into the classification, like the different ones. And I have seen some workforce analysis with that kind of depth. I don't know how they did it, but they're able to break it down further because yes, it might not look like there's an underrepresentation in one sort of occupational category, but if you actually looked at it deeper, you'll see there may be, right? There may be a cluster of one of the equity groups in one particular one. So if you're able to do it, you should do it. You should definitely do it by the actual classifications rather than the broader occupational category.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
I will say, and it makes your life on the HR end a little bit easier if you want to look simply at the filling your gaps that you identify by classification with recruitment, because I need to open so many posters for so many positions. Can I do a targeted recruitment? So you can also go down that road if that's a strategy you want to address that gap. But I will say at this point, those that are on 9.1 PeopleSoft, I don't know that they have the capacity which we used to have. So that's why I have concerns for the future, but that's a whole other conversation we could have. So for promotions, again, you use whatever benchmark you feel comfortable using, and then you should promote who you have unless you see specific gaps. So let's say we see an underrepresentation in specific job categories as well as EE groups, then you would not promote who you have. You'd go above that representation rate to make sure that you eventually address that systemic issue as well. So I don't know that we have any questions on that one. On est correct. Fait plaisir, j'essaye. Force recruitment. Then this is where we say you should recruit who's out there. So because you need to recruit folks from the Canadian population, really. So your recruitment goal could be who's out there in terms of WFA or whatever benchmark you want to use. But really, if you see specific gaps, again, you can hire at a higher rate than what you see even as a WFA, LMA, or whatever. Because really, if you keep hiring at the same rate, then who's out there, but you have a really big gap, you'll still need to increase so you can eventually fill that gap. And it sounds very strange, let's say, but if I took WFA is 13%, and I am at 7%, if I hire at 13%, but I keep losing people, I'm still going to have a gap long term. So crank it to 15, 17%, and then eventually, if you stabilize your population, you will fill that gap. Ça fonctionne. We're good. Separation, which is a bit sad. It seems like people forgot that you're supposed to track separation rates, but really that's your departure. I just mentioned stabilizing your population. So it's one thing to hire from various equity seeking groups, equity deserving or equity denied. That's another conversation we could have, but it's very important that you look at the departure rates, because is it une porte tournante? So is it that people are coming in and just leaving? Is it that specific groups are leaving at a very high rate? Like the departure rates or separation rates, whichever you want to call them, is very informative in terms of where you might have specific issues. Now, there's also ways to look at them not within the scope of EE data per se, but really in terms of EE analysis, you should still look at why are the people leaving, like the actual codes as to why they're leaving, where are they leaving to, control as well the variables like retirements, as well as let's say resignation is also very telling. So look at all of this information, but really you want to keep your 1-to-1 ratio if you have good representation, or really make it as low as you can to keep a certain type of representation. Because if you're 1-to-1, it's one person coming in, one person leaving, but you're trying to stabilize that population. And that's also looping it back to the clerk's call to action when they said to have inclusion measures. There's not a million ways to track how inclusion is effective. Yes, there's the PSCS and all those qualitative surveys that are done, but in terms of quantitative, it's like, can you maintain your ratio of departures below 1 to 1% leaving. Je parle beaucoup, je suis désolée. Any other questions on this?
Can I just add a little point?
Yes.
So I think the reasons why we're focusing like on promotions, separations, and recruitment, that's legislatively required. Like you've got to do that analysis on those in those areas. I've seen some things coming from departments where they're not looking at that. I'm not sure why not, but it is required to do those kinds of analysis in that too.
Thank you. So really your biannual tables, because I think 90% to 95% of organizations usually have biannual tables that look somewhat like this. Might be different colors, might be a different format, but you should really have those 4 tables in. So representation, promotions, recruitment, as well as separations. So if you're missing one of them, you should get in touch with your HR analytics folks.
And one last thing, I just want a clarification because there's a comment about overrepresentation. And I do want to point, when we talk about overrepresentation, we are talking about equity groups who are clustered or overrepresented in particular categories like admin, like administrative, right? So it's like they're clustered at low levels, you know, and salary is another category that you're supposed to be capturing as well. So like you're supposed to be looking at, oh, this is where all the, you know, persons with disabilities are clustered at, even though the representation rate might say that they're not underrepresented. So that is a good point there around looking at that.
Wonderful. And if people have questions, there was the presentation on the disproportionality index, so it might be a good item to venture in and look at what it means and how it can be applied. Follow-ups, as we mentioned, you should be looking at annual follow-up. So it's to measure, as I said, a reasonable progress. So have you made any types of improvements, or really it's stagnant, or really it's gotten worse, which happens also based on very specific social items that might occur or political items that might occur. So just keep track of your reasonable progress against your numbers as well as the initiatives within the scope of your EE plan. You should ensure that the plan is implemented and monitored, as we mentioned, and periodic review. As we said, it's around an ESR. We're hoping some will never do an ESR unless they get audited, but really you should be able to review everything on a specific schedule. Make sure that you're not, I've seen people extend their plans as well, but extending the plan often means that you're not taking stock of everything you should be taking stock when you're creating a new plan. So make sure that if you're extending, it's like 6 months to a year. Don't go on extending. Like you really need to make sure that you're doing your workforce analysis, your ESR, your full scan. So those extensions, very minimal, could happen. Let's say COVID hit and then everybody was scrambling to find solutions. Okay, but just do them just because to people it's easier. I'm not a big fan, and I don't think it would fly legislatively either. Any points to add here, Seema, or anybody else?
I think we're good.
Wonderful. And this is a big one. I love the visual of it. So reality, as we know, and we had this conversation on Friday in terms of if you've seen videos about the privilege walk, I would relate this to the reality. So quick topo maybe. And privilege walk is when you have a group of various individuals and then questions are being asked, and then you take a step forward or a step back depending on the questions and how you would answer on your lived experiences. So that's reality. People come from various backgrounds. Some of those social economics and other factors and identity factors will have an impact on where they start at in life. through no fault of their own. It's just how life goes. Equality is everybody's given the same tools to do the same task, which might not work for everyone. So it's really everybody has the same thing, so everybody's equal. The effects on the end might not be equal, but everybody is in the same setting. Equity is everybody is given different tools to help them. And this is where employment equity comes into play now. And I'm a dreamer. I like to say I'm a dreamer, but we're looking really at social justice. So employment equity is a step towards social justice. It's one tool. It's a legislative tools for us to make actual concrete progress, but it's not the ultimate tools. Like there's an array of various tools to be able to get there, but ultimately, and I don't know if Dr. Nicholas is on the line, as he referred to section 15. Je t'aime toi. So it was section 15 of the charter, which aimed at substantive equity. So really, that was the initial goal when they created the act for social justice, because there were such big inequities between the various groups and the majoritized population. Donc, c'est tout un contexte, là, mais I think the image is insightful because we're trying to remove those systemic barriers. Here it's represented by a fence, but really here it might be how we do training, how we do staffing, how we even interact with folks. As we mentioned, it might be certain tones, certain cultures, and I'm talking about organizational cultures. Sorry, in l'anglais cette semaine. Organizational cultures that are not as inclusive or open to people that don't fit in the specific box that they have in mind. So I think this image says a lot. And again, you have resources that you can look up on your own and courses through CSPS should you want to learn some more. Any other questions or comments? We're good? Everybody's good? Everybody's shy?
Well, while people are thinking of other questions, can I just make a comment?
Yes.
Sure. So I didn't highlight this in the beginning, but I actually sit on the National Joint Council Joint Employment Equity Committee. So that's the actual Employment Equity Committee between, like, at a national level with Treasury Board, Public Service Commission on the and other employer representatives, and then bargaining agents on the other side. And it's a joint committee where we consult and we collaborate and we go through in quite detail, and some analysis are done there. So I'm saying that while you're thinking of your questions, is that kind of a committee should also be sort of reflective in the departments at a departmental level. So I know, like PSAC, there's components that we have. So at that departmental level, joint committee specifically where you would be going through all of this in detail and getting input would be the ideal sort of scenario to have. I know some have become like the diversity and DEI sort of committees, or there's representatives of members from equity groups, which is really great because it's so important to get their input into this when we're looking at the Employment Equity Plan. But I want to emphasize that you should be having those kinds of discussions specifically with bargaining agents. I'm saying that again because I've noticed that hasn't been happening when I'm talking to our counterparts or my counterparts in the union in different departments. So happy to talk about that if anybody wants to email me or anything like that.
Thank you. Are Schedule 1 employers subject to implementing the call to action forward direction? 2. I can ask. I don't have the answer. I'll be completely truthful. I believe it's a whole of public service approach, meaning separate agencies, but I don't have the very straight and through answer to your question. So I will ask PCO and come back to you on this. Correct? Vicky, ça marche? So if people don't have any questions or comments, maybe it's something that we do yearly. I think it was overwhelmingly due. Sebastian, go right ahead.
Marilyn, c'était une très
Yes.
belle présentation.
Merci.
I didn't have a question, but then I read comments on the chats, and I thought this would have been a good point of discussion as well. A comment raised by my colleague Brenda. It's long, but it makes a lot of sense. It says an important point about review and classification was made evident by Dr. Nicholas' important work on these points. His work clearly demonstrates that almost universally, racialized and more especially Black employees find themselves at the bottom of every occupational category. I suspect, without having seen the data for other equity groups, that they are actually or usually at the lowest possible classification within a category. In my view, this points directly to and provides stark evidence of systemic barriers. Surely it cannot be that Black employees or Inuit, First Nation or Métis employees are less meritorious than their white racialized colleagues. In my mind, this goes back to providing evidence of and supporting policies and programs to support equity in the workplace. I thought this was a brilliant comment that would have been a good point of discussion. Maybe time would not permit, but it is the perspective of racism and discrimination usually is not brought forward when we're analyzing numbers. So we work for the Anti-Racism, Anti-Discrimination Secretariat. We apply the anti-racism, anti-discrimination lenses to different policies and procedures, programs. And, we ought to be looking at these numbers. They're old, and I said a lot with Dr. Martin discussing this. And we do know that we need to change policies and procedures and the way we do business. Otherwise, we continue to perpetuate this. Last comment I want to say is that when you look at those numbers, it's a stark evidence that the women are, for example, one of the category, the groups or target groups in employment equity. And then if you don't really analyze it from a racial point of view, which I'm alluding to intersectionality here, you would think that women are doing great, when in fact it's only just one category of white women, and these are just facts that are in an executive position, right? So sometimes those numbers, they hide a lot of truth behind them, right? So these kinds of discussions should accompany these interpretations of numbers, racialized, and then you get to see why we're talking about disaggregation. A lot of people don't get it. And intersectionality is not talked about a lot. In that same category of women, for example, how many Black women are in that category? How many Indigenous women are in that category? How many other group of women are in that category? So you don't see those. But it looks good, numbers have gone up. But when you break it down, you see there's a serious practice of racism in the progression of this group of women, for example. We can't even talk about indigenous. We can't even talk about the people with disability. Some of them going into the negative. And then when you get into the visual minority, it's pathetic because, you know, the buzzword here is disaggregate, disaggregate, disaggregate. Anyways, I thought that was a very good presentation by the way, Eileen, but we should have covered the anti-racism, anti-discrimination perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of intersecting identities, that's one thing that needs to happen in the future in terms of how we can report on information. It does happen at times in ESR as well. You will see the binary male-female for the three other groups, excluding women. But in terms of intersecting identities, they're very rarely looked at. So you're completely right. And Brenda is a wise person as well.
If I would just add to that, I think where departments can disaggregate the data, I know the WFA, we heard that we don't have the WFA for the specific disaggregated groups, and within like all of the equity groups, women, racialized, indigenous, or persons with disabilities, where you can actually say, you know, within the women, these are how many are in the racialized or indigenous, then do that. Right? I know the WFA is not there, but it will give an idea who's there. So I think there's some capacities for some places to do that, and I'm not sure your internal processes. I heard there's some issues with it, but where you can, I think departments should be heading that way. And when we see, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, when we have the Employment Equity Review Task Force, they're going to speak to that, right? So I would suggest that we get ahead, and where we can do that, do it, right? And not wait until legislation changes and maybe that will be a requirement or not. I'm just, you know, speculating. I'm hoping that there will be. And so though this is a really important discussion to have moving forward, you know, actually moving back as well, we should have been doing it, but moving forward, starting to do that if we're not, because I like to see that data. And I don't want the excuse to be that we don't have the WFA yet for those disaggregated data. We can still see who's in the workplace.
Yeah, so self-ID is still feasible. I just want to have that very tiny parenthesis, whereas we're still sitting within the binary, because for gender or sex representation in terms of self-ID, it's extracted from the pay files, so there's no self-identification process for as it really should be. So I'm just putting a cautious spin on this. It's just whenever you will be extracting those information, because you should in theory be able to extract what's in your current self-ID system, you will see it on the binary spectrum, whereas you could have people not represented that would fall in another category. So it might be, I don't want to say it's like the majority, but there's still going to be misrepresentation of people's identity within the data that you will be capturing if you do that. Just I think it's still a very valuable exercise. It's just I want people to be aware that those identities are not yet captured, and we're still using the very binary male-female on the pay files to extract into the self-identification portal or whatever data we're using in terms of tables. But yes, it's a worthy exercise. It's very telling as well. So thank you for the comments and additions. Any other questions or comments? We're good.
I see the comment by Tessa. I see a comment by Tessa, and it was a good comment. Just wanted to, we're always looking for more data. right? They
Yes.
ask for more data. Just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yes, I'd love to see one. It's a combination. As I said, I'm a dreamer. I'd love to see the identity factors that will be captured in the next TBS app, the portal for self-identification. But I'd still love to see the old capacity for reporting that used to exist with PeopleSoft 8.9. I think this would have been the perfect combination. So Justice, you're lucky with the self-declaration tab, if I may say so, because it was created really with the PeopleSoft 8.9, and you do have all of these identity factors in there that you are able to use on top of just the analysis. It can also serve for HR purposes because you're bypassing the sections 9.1 and 9.3. So kudos to you. But if people don't have more questions or comments, I will let people breathe, take a moment, an extra 5 minutes for themselves. Well, Brenda, I appreciate you and all that you do and all that you've done. And thank you for being present from retirement and still working. That's dedication. And thank you so much, Seema, for being present and helping lead this conversation. I do appreciate it so much. It means a lot to me when we can come together and have this conversation with people. And thanks to the interpreters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take good care, everyone. Be safe.